She bathed a man who couldn't feel a thing, and told him every secret she'd ever buried. He heard every word, and the moment he opened his eyes, the first thing he said was her name.
Martha.
If you've ever believed that love finds its way through the darkest silence, this story is for you. Subscribe and leave a comment below. Your words mean more than you know. England, 1821. Late autumn had arrived in that particular way it does in the English countryside. Not with a gentle turning of leaves, but with a sudden, brutal cold that stripped the trees bare overnight and left the roads treacherous with frost. It was on one such road, on the third night of November, that the accident happened. The Kingsley carriage was returning from a hunting party at Lord Ashwick's estate when the lead horse shied at something in the dark. A fox, or perhaps nothing at all, some phantom conjured by the wind, and the whole equipage tipped sideways into the ditch running alongside Wyndham Road. The coachman was thrown clear and survived with a broken collarbone. The footman clinging to the rear was luckier still, landing in soft mud. Duke Percival Kingsley was not lucky. He was 31 years old, tall and broad across the shoulders, with the kind of careless physical confidence that comes from never having truly suffered. He'd spent his life moving through ballrooms and drawing rooms and bedchambers with the ease of a man who knew the world would always make room for him. He'd been amusing company since the age of 17. He'd been handsome since birth. He'd never once been denied anything he wanted. The carriage door struck him as it fell. He landed against a stone culvert with a force that silenced him completely. By the time they carried him back to Kingsley Hall, that vast, cold Georgian manor that had intimidated every guest who'd ever entered it, the physician had already been sent for, and the household staff stood in the entrance hall with the particular stillness of people who do not yet know whether to grieve. The verdict was delivered in the low, careful voice physicians use when they want to sound certain, and are anything but. There was swelling of the brain, the doctor said. There was nothing to do but wait. The Duke might wake in hours, or days, or not at all. He said this last part while looking at the fireplace rather than at the Dowager Duchess, who received the news standing perfectly upright in a silk dressing gown, her expression giving nothing away, as though her eldest son falling into a coma was merely another inconvenience the world had seen fit to deliver to her door. Martha Finch had arrived at Kingsley Hall 6 weeks before the accident, and in that time she had managed to become nearly invisible, which was precisely what she intended. She was 22 years old, the daughter of a tenant farmer from a village outside Dorchester who had fallen into debt 3 winters running and had solved the problem, as men in his position often did, by sending his daughter into service. Martha had understood the transaction clearly. She did not blame her father exactly. She simply filed the fact away alongside the other facts of her life. That the world was indifferent, that beauty was a liability in a household full of men, that the best armour was silence and a plain face, and the habit of moving quickly through rooms without drawing attention. She was not a plain girl. This was the inconvenient truth that no amount of careful dress or downcast eyes could entirely conceal. She had her mother's dark hair and her father's stubbornness in the set of her jaw, and she carried herself with a quiet dignity that the other maids found either admirable or irritating, depending on their temperament. Mrs. Hadley, the housekeeper, had decided within a week of Martha's arrival that the girl was reliable and therefore useful, which was the highest compliment Mrs. Hadley paid to anyone. When the Duke was brought home unconscious and the household turned itself inside out with anxiety, it was Mrs. Hadley who assigned Martha to the sick-room rotation. "You're steady," the housekeeper told her, which was not a question. Martha said yes, she was steady, and took up her post. The first time she walked into the Duke's chamber, she expected to feel nothing beyond the professional attentiveness of a well-trained servant. She'd heard enough about Percival Kingsley from the other maids, his charm, his habits, his parade of admirers, to have formed a thorough and unflattering picture of him. He was the sort of man, she'd concluded, who was used and useless in equal measure, used by society for his title and his wealth, and useless to anyone who wanted something real. But the man lying in that great canopied bed was not the man she'd imagined. He was still, not the stillness of sleep, but something deeper, something that made the room feel like a held breath. And she noticed, in spite of herself, that without the performance of charm, without the smile that everyone described as devastating, without the easy authority of a man who'd never been told no, he looked younger. He looked like someone who had not yet decided who he was going to be. Martha set down the basin, wrung out the cloth, and got to work. It began accidentally. The first night, she was simply doing her job, changing the dressings on the wound at his temple, wiping the fever sweat from his brow, checking his pulse the way the physician had shown her. She worked in silence, as she always did. But the silence in that room had a peculiar quality to it. It pressed in close, and the candle threw long shadows. And outside the wind was doing something melancholy to the oak trees along the south lawn. "Your horse did this to you," she said, without meaning to. Her voice sounded strange in the quiet room, too loud and then immediately too small. "Or your coachman's horse, I suppose. Either way, some animal has better sense than its master." He said nothing, naturally, but she found herself continuing anyway. There was something about speaking to someone who could not judge her, could not dismiss her, could not look through her the way grand people looked through servants, that loosened something in her chest she hadn't known was knotted. By the third night, she was telling him about Dorchester, about the farmhouse that smelled of wet wool and wood smoke, about her mother, who had died when Martha was 14, and who had been the only person in her life who ever looked at her as though she were worth looking at. She told him this without self-pity, in the same matter-of-fact tone she used for everything, which somehow made it worse, or better, depending on how you looked at it. By the end of the first week, she was telling him about the fear, not the manageable kind, not the fear of being dismissed or of missing a button on a uniform, but the deep fear, the one she never said aloud to anyone, the fear that the life she was living was the only life she was going to get, that she would grow old in other people's houses, invisible, uncounted, and that one day she would simply stop, like a clock that nobody winds. "Why, I am not asking for your sympathy," she told him on the 9th night, wringing the cloth over the basin with particular force. "You're a duke. You've never wanted for a single thing in your life. You wouldn't understand." And then, because the candle was guttering and the room was very quiet, and he still hadn't moved. "But you're listening. I'll give you that much. You're the best listener I've ever had." She said it wryly, meant it as a small joke at both their expenses, but the truth underneath it embarrassed her, and she turned away quickly and did not look at his face for the rest of that night. What Martha did not know, what she had no way of knowing, was that somewhere deep inside the stillness, something was listening. Whether it was consciousness or instinct, or some strange mercy of the body's own making, the sound of her voice had become the one fixed point in the dark. Every night, in the formless dark where pain and time had no edges, he heard her. It was Lady Edwina Croft who first noticed. She arrived at Kingsley Hall on a Tuesday in the second week of December, having made the journey from her family's estate in Shropshire, with the focused determination of a woman who understood that her position in life was not yet secured and could not afford to be careless about it. Lady Edwina was 26 years old, accomplished in the manner that the daughters of earls are accomplished: French, pianoforte, watercolours, excellent posture. And she had been informally attached to Percival Kingsley for the better part of 2 years by the understanding of both their families, if not by any formal declaration on his part. She was not cruel. It would be easier if she were. She was simply a woman who had been raised in a world with very clear rules about who belonged where, and she applied those rules with the unconscious confidence of someone who has never had cause to question them. When Lady Edwina swept into the Duke's chamber on the morning of her arrival and found Martha adjusting the curtains, the task taking perhaps 30 seconds longer than strictly necessary, Martha's attention caught by the quality of the winter light on the Duke's face. Lady Edwina's expression shifted in that small, precise way that meant something had been noted and filed away for future use. "You're the maid assigned to this room." The tone was not unkind. It was simply the tone of someone who has never had to be unkind, because the world generally arranges itself to their satisfaction without requiring it. Martha curtsied and said she was "Your Ladyship." "See to it that the fire is kept higher. The Duke runs cold." A pause. Then, "And you may go now. I'll sit with him myself." Martha went, but she felt, walking down the corridor and down the servants' staircase and back into the ordinary world of buckets and lists and Mrs. Hadley's instructions, something she had no right to feel and knew better than to examine too closely. Something that felt, with uncomfortable accuracy, like loss. She told herself it was nothing. She had grown accustomed to the routine of the sick room, the quiet, the candlelight, the way the night hours stretched differently in there than they did anywhere else. That was all it was. Routine. She told herself this very firmly, and she almost believed it. Lady Edwina did not stay past 9. She had her own comfort to consider, and sleeping in a chair beside an unconscious man was not something she was prepared to do indefinitely. By 10 o'clock on Tuesday night, Martha had quietly reclaimed her post. She told herself she would not speak. She had been becoming reckless, she knew, too free with her thoughts, too loose with her tongue in that room where nobody could hear her. It was a bad habit, and Lady Edwina's presence in the house was a useful reminder of where the boundaries lay and why they existed. She lasted until midnight. "There is a woman here," she said finally, to the candle rather than to him. "Lady Edwina Croft. She's very beautiful and very correct, and everybody expects you to marry her." A pause while she adjusted the compress at his temple. "I'm sure she'll make you very happy in the way that people like you are happy, which I suspect is mostly comfortable and occasionally dull." She heard herself and stopped. "I shouldn't have said that. I don't know anything about her, or about you, really." Another pause. The wind had picked up again. "Except that you're 31 years old, and you've never once had to fight for a single thing you wanted. And I wonder sometimes if you even know what wanting really feels like. The real kind. Not wanting a brandy or wanting a woman to laugh at your joke. I mean wanting something that costs you something." She went quiet after that for a long time, working without speaking, listening to the sound of his breathing, which was slow and even and told her nothing. "My mother used to say," she said at last, very softly, "that the people worth loving are always the ones who've been broken at least once, because they know what it is to put themselves back together. They know what they're made of." She looked at his face in the low light. "I wonder what you're made of, Your Grace." "I suppose we're about to find out." In the dark, behind his stillness, something heard her, something that had been waiting, without knowing what it was waiting for, felt the shape of those words settle like a stone dropped into still water. And the ripples moved outward, slow and certain, through whatever silence remained. He woke on the 23rd of November, 1821, at 20 minutes past 4 in the morning. Martha was there. She had fallen asleep in the chair by his bed, something she'd never done before and would have been mortified to be caught doing. Her head tipped sideways and one hand resting, palm up, in her lap. The candle had burned down to almost nothing. He came back slowly, the way a tide comes in, not all at once but in increments, the darkness thinning by degrees, the weight lifting from his chest a little at a time. The first thing he was aware of was pain. The second was cold. The third was the sound of breathing that was not his own. He opened his eyes. The room swam, then steadied. A candle, a window with frost on the glass, a chair beside his bed. And in the chair, he didn't know her face. He'd never seen her before in his life. And yet the moment his eyes found her, something in his chest did a thing it had never done in 31 years of easy charm and practiced desire. It lurched, as though recognizing something it had always known was there, but had simply never been given a name before. He tried to speak. What came out, in a voice wrecked by 3 weeks of disuse, was a single word: Martha. She woke instantly, the sleep of someone who never fully let their guard down. She was on her feet before she was fully conscious, her hand going to the compress on his head by instinct, and then she went entirely still. His eyes were open. He was looking at her. "You're awake," she said, and was furious to find that her voice shook. Apparently, his voice was dry with disuse, the words costing him something. Don't go, please." She'd already taken a step toward the door to call for help. She stopped, turned back. He was watching her with an expression she could not read, an expression she had no framework for, because she had never seen it on the face of anyone who looked at her, least of all a duke. "I need to fetch the physician," she said, her voice back under control, professional and even. "And Mrs. Hadley, and in a moment." A pause while he seemed to gather himself, the effort of speaking visible in the tension around his jaw. "What you said about being broken." The blood left her face. "I heard you," he said simply. "I heard all of it." She turned and went for the physician without another word, but her hands were shaking as she opened the door, and they did not stop shaking for the rest of that night. The household erupted. That was the only word for it. By 6 in the morning, Kingsley Hall was lit from cellar to attic, and the Dowager Duchess had appeared in the corridor outside the Duke's chamber fully dressed, as though she had slept that way. Lady Edwina arrived at 8, composed and gracious, sitting beside the bed and holding Percival's hand with the proprietary gentleness of a woman who understood her role in a situation like this and intended to play it correctly. Percival submitted to all of it with the patience of a man who is still in pain and lacks the energy to resist. He answered the physician's questions. He drank the broth. He accepted his mother's cool hand on his forehead and his brother Alistair's hearty relief, which expressed itself, characteristically, as a joke about nearly missing his shooting party. But his eyes, through all of it, kept moving to the door. Martha did not come back into the room. She had been reassigned, not maliciously, simply practically, because there were now family members and physicians and Lady Edwina to fill the space that had been hers in the dark, quiet hours. She was back to her ordinary duties. Fires and linens and carrying trays up the back stairs, invisible again, which was what she was supposed to be. She told herself this was a relief. She told herself that the exchange in the pre-dawn hours had been the product of his disorientation, that he would not remember it clearly, that the brain behaved strangely when it returned from wherever it had been. She told herself all of this in a very reasonable internal voice, and was aware, with the clear-eyed honesty that was her particular blessing and curse, that she believed none of it. He had said her name before he'd seen her face. That was the fact she kept returning to. She could not make it mean less than it meant. She had tried. Percival's recovery was faster than the physician expected, and slower than the Dowager Duchess wished. He was confined to his rooms for a week, then permitted to walk in the gallery, then grudgingly allowed downstairs. Lady Edwina was a frequent and correct visitor. His brother Alistair was a less frequent and much louder one. The household adjusted itself around his convalescence with practiced efficiency. He noticed Martha on the fourth day. She was crossing the lower corridor with an armful of folded linen, moving quickly and quietly in the way she always moved, and she didn't see him until she'd almost walked into him. The linen wobbled. She caught it. They were 3 feet apart, and for a long moment neither of them spoke. She curtsied and said, "Your Grace," and made to move past him. "You've been avoiding me," he said. She kept moving. "I've been working, Your Grace. I do it in most of the same rooms you walk through. It's coincidence rather than intention." "Is it?" Not a question. He had turned to watch her go, and she could feel it, that attention, like heat from a fire she wasn't supposed to be standing near. She went around the corner and down the servants' passage, and didn't stop until she was in the linen room with the door closed behind her. She stood there for a moment in the dark, with the cold sheets pressed against her chest, and made herself breathe normally. This was the thing about Percival Kingsley that nobody had warned her about, not the charm, which she'd expected and steeled herself against, but the quality of his attention. When he looked at you entirely, as if there was nothing else in the room worth looking at, as if you were, against all evidence and expectation, the most interesting thing he had ever encountered. She knew it was probably something he did naturally, like breathing. She knew it was the trick of a man who'd spent his whole life making people feel chosen without ever actually choosing. She knew all of this, knowing it helped considerably less than it should have. He, for his part, was experiencing something he had no prior experience of and found deeply inconvenient. He had wanted women before, easily, frequently, with the light appetite of someone who's never had to go hungry. This was entirely different. This was the unsettling, bone-deep recognition of someone your whole self has been waiting for. And it didn't care about inconvenience or consequence or Lady Edwina Croft. He thought about what she'd said, about the people worth loving being those who'd been broken and put themselves back together. He turned this over and over in his mind, like a coin he couldn't stop handling. And he asked himself, for the first time with any real seriousness, what he was made of. He was not certain he liked the answer. The second week of December brought the first real snow of the season, and a letter from Lord Ashwick inviting Percival to a gathering in January. A pointed reminder that the world expected him back in it, unchanged and charming, as soon as possible. The Dowager Duchess had placed the letter on his breakfast tray with a pointed look that communicated several things simultaneously. The primary one being that it was time to stop being ill and resume being a duke. He was in the library at 11:30, staring at the fire and thinking about nothing he wanted to think about, when he heard the door open. He expected a footman. He looked up and it was Martha, with a tray for the fire, the coal hod and the small brush. And she stopped when she saw him, clearly having expected an empty room. She hesitated. He watched her weigh her options and decide on the professional approach. She curtsied, murmured an apology for disturbing him, and began to tend the fire with the focused efficiency of a woman who intends to be invisible regardless of circumstances. "Do you know," he said from the armchair, in a conversational tone, "I once sat beside Lady Astamore at dinner for 3 hours and learned nothing whatsoever about her. In 23 nights, you told me more true things about yourself than most people manage in a lifetime of acquaintance." The brush went still against the grate. He watched her back, the very careful stillness of it, and the way she seemed to be deciding something. "That was not intended for you to hear," she said, without turning around. "With respect. I know. That's what made it extraordinary." He paused. "I'm not going to pretend I didn't. I can't. I'm sorry if that's... I understand if it makes you uncomfortable, but I'm not going to pretend." She set the brush down carefully and stood up and turned around. Her face, in the firelight, was doing something complicated, all that feeling running underneath the surface, and her jaw set against it the way it always was, against showing too much, against being seen wanting what she had no right to want. "Your Grace," she said, "I am a housemaid. You are a duke. There is a lady in this house who has been brought here under the expectation that you will marry her. Whatever you think you heard." A pause. "Whatever you think you felt, it was a coma. It was darkness and disorientation and 3 weeks of helplessness that no one of your station is ever meant to experience. And it has made things feel significant that are not, I assure you." She picked up the coal hod and walked to the door. "Ah, Martha." He said her name the way he'd said it in the dark of that room when he'd first opened his eyes. Not as a command, not with the easy confidence of his rank, but with something raw underneath it that made her close her eyes briefly at the door. "I heard what you said about your mother, about the clock that nobody winds." She left without responding, but she stood in the cold corridor outside the library door for a full 3 minutes before she could make herself walk away. The Dowager Duchess of Kingsley had not maintained her position in society for 40 years by being inattentive. She had raised Percival from boyhood with a clear-eyed understanding of exactly what his charm was worth. Not sentiment, but currency, and currency with a specific and deliberate purpose. He would marry well. He would continue the line. He would not do anything foolish. She was therefore acutely displeased when, on the 15th of December, her lady's maid reported, in the carefully neutral tone of a woman who has learned that information delivered without editorializing is received better and rewarded more reliably, that the Duke had been seen twice in proximity to the new maid, and that the second time there had been words exchanged that were not of the household business variety. The Dowager said nothing. She finished her tea. Then she sent for Mrs. Hadley. The conversation with Mrs. Hadley was brief and conclusive. Martha Finch would be transferred to duties in the East Wing, which was the oldest and least used part of the house, where she would be engaged in the inventory and airing of rooms that had not been properly attended to since the old Duke's time. It was not a demotion, exactly. It was simply an arrangement of geography. Mrs. Hadley delivered this information to Martha that evening. Martha received it with the stillness she'd trained herself to maintain when the world moved pieces around her without asking her opinion. She said yes, Mrs. Hadley. She said she understood. Mrs. Hadley. Alone in the small room she shared with one of the other maids, who was mercifully asleep. She lay in the dark and was honest with herself in the way that she could only manage in the very small hours. She was in trouble, not the practical kind, though that existed too, but the kind that had no sensible remedy. She had done the precise thing she had spent her whole life knowing she must not do. She had let herself feel something she had no claim to feel, for a person she had no right to want, in a world that would not permit it regardless. She was angry, underneath the ache, angry at herself for talking in that room, for letting the walls come down, for being foolish enough to believe that darkness and silence were the same as safety, angry at him for hearing and for saying so, and for the way his face looked when he said her name, angry, most of all, at the fact that she could not stop wanting things she could not have, and that the wanting showed no signs of stopping just because wanting them was inconvenient. Alistair Kingsley, Viscount Marley, was younger than his brother by 4 years, louder by approximately 400, and significantly less interested in the performance of ducal dignity. He had spent most of the autumn in Scotland and had arrived at Kingsley Hall with mud on his boots and a flask in his coat pocket, and an uncanny ability to notice things that other people preferred to leave unnoticed. He found his brother in the East Wing on the 22nd of December, moving through rooms that hadn't been opened in years, ostensibly on the pretext of assessing them for refurbishment. Alistair looked at the rooms, which were empty and cold, and held nothing of interest, and then looked at his brother, and arrived at the correct conclusion almost immediately. Mother moved her, Alistair said, without preamble, because he'd never seen the point of preamble. Percival turned from the window. I don't know what you're referring to. The maid, the dark-haired one. Mother had her reassigned. He settled himself onto a dusty chair with the comfort of a man who finds other people's discomfort more interesting than his own. Dare I ask why you're wandering around the East Wing on a Tuesday morning when you're supposed to be convalescing? A long silence. Then, I don't know what I'm doing. Alistair looked at his brother, really looked, in the way he sometimes did when he set the performance of cheerful shallowness aside, and saw something he hadn't seen before, or rather something he'd never expected to see. Something that was, if he was honest, a little frightening in its sincerity. Well, Alistair said finally, that's new. Percival said nothing. He was looking out at the winter grounds, the frozen fountain, the bare elms, the grey sky pressing down over everything, with the expression of a man who has always moved through the world at a comfortable remove, and has suddenly, without warning, found himself in it. She's a housemaid, Alistair said, not unkindly. Mother will... I know what Mother will do. And Edwina, I know. A pause. I know all of it. Alistair turned his flask over in his hands. What did she say to you while you were, out? Percival was quiet for a moment. She said the people worth loving are the ones who've been broken at least once. A longer silence this time. Said Alistair, which was more than he usually said about things that mattered, and left it at that. Kingsley Hall on Christmas Eve was a particular kind of beautiful. Greens along the staircase railing, candles in every window, the smell of pine and warmed wine moving through the rooms, with the confidence of things that have belonged there for a very long time. The family gathered. Guests arrived. Lady Edwina was present and elegant and said all the correct things to all the correct people. Martha worked. She carried things and set things and lit fires in rooms that hadn't been lit since autumn, and she moved through the warm, laughing, candle-lit world of the family's Christmas with the practiced invisibility of her profession, present and absent simultaneously, which was a skill she had mastered to the point where it barely cost her anything anymore. Almost. She was in the lower corridor at 9:30, returning a tray to the kitchen, when she heard the music Someone had opened the drawing room doors and the sounds spilled out. A pianoforte, and then voices, something seasonal and unserious that people were clearly not bothering to sing properly and were enjoying all the more for it. She stopped for a moment, just a moment, outside the circle of warm light from the doorway. Percival was standing near the fireplace. He was laughing at something Alistair had said, his head tipped back, and in that moment he was everything his reputation promised, effortlessly at ease, lit from within by the particular grace of a man in his own home, among his own people. Beautiful in the way that certain things are beautiful, fully, almost painfully, without apology. And then, as if he could feel the weight of her attention, as if in 23 nights her attention had become something tangible to him, he turned his head and found her in the doorway. The laughter didn't quite leave his face, but something underneath it changed, the quality of it, the way light changes when a cloud moves across the sun, not darker, just different. She walked away before he could say anything. She walked away quickly, and she did not look back. And if she felt the point of his gaze between her shoulder blades for the rest of the evening, she told herself she imagined it. It happened in January. The new year had arrived grey and cold, and the house guests had thinned out. And Lady Edwina had returned to Shropshire with the understanding, communicated in the formal and civilized language of the Dowager Duchess, that a formal announcement might be expected in the spring. Percival had said nothing to contradict this. He was aware that his silence was its own kind of consent, and he was aware of what that made him, and he was trying to work out what he intended to do about it when the decision was made for him. He found Martha in the gallery on a Thursday afternoon in the second week of January 1822, dusting the frames of portraits that had not been dusted in longer than she would have needed to stand on a step stool to reach. She heard him coming. She always heard him. She'd noticed, which was irritating and probably physiological. Some animal awareness the body develops in the presence of particular dangers, and she kept her back to him and kept dusting. "Lady Edwina has gone back to Shropshire," he said. "I know, Your Grace. My mother is planning an engagement announcement for April." The cloth moved in careful, even strokes along the frame. "Congratulations, Your Grace. I haven't agreed to it." The cloth stopped. Martha. He had come closer. She could hear it. The proximity of him. That attention she had no defences against. "I know you're frightened. I know what the world looks like from where you're standing. I know I don't have the right to ask anything of you, but I need you to know—" "Stop." She turned around. Her face was controlled, but only barely, the jaw set in that way he had come to recognize as the sign of something significant being held back. "Stop. Please. You know things about me that I never meant anyone to know. You know my fears and my history and the smallest, most unguarded parts of how I think, and I know nothing about you, nothing real, and you want to stand here and—" She stopped. "You have no idea what you are to me, and I cannot afford to tell you." The silence between them was very full. "Then let me tell you what you are to me," he said, very quietly. "You are the first person who has ever spoken to me as though I were worth being honest with. You are the reason I came back." He paused. "I don't mean that poetically. I mean I was in the dark, and your voice was the only thing in it, and I followed it. That is not something I know how to dismiss because it's inconvenient." She looked at him for a long moment, and then she said the most honest thing she had said to him outside of a room where she'd believed he couldn't hear her. "If you do this, whatever this is, I will lose everything. My position, my character, the only security I have ever had. A pause. What do you lose? He didn't answer immediately, and she nodded. Once, as though his silence had confirmed something. That is the only honest answer you could have given me, she said. And it is exactly the problem. She picked up the cloth. Please let me do my work, Your Grace. 3 days later, a letter arrived on the tray outside Martha's door. There was no envelope, only a folded page sealed with plain wax. Her name written on the outside in a hand she didn't recognize. She opened it before she had fully woken up, which she later thought was the only reason she read it all the way through without stopping. It was not a love letter. It was not the sort of thing a man in his position was supposed to write at all, and she suspected he had known that when he wrote it. It was simply an account of what he had heard in the dark, not the moments she'd felt most exposed. He had enough grace not to quote those back to her. But the things she'd said about wanting a life that was hers, about the particular loneliness of being useful to everyone and known by no one, about her mother. He wrote, I am 31 years old and I have never fought for anything. Not because I lacked the means, but because I lacked the reason. I have been given every advantage and used none of them to become anything in particular. I do not think this is the kind of man you respect. I am not sure it is the kind of man I respect either. But I am asking, not for anything you cannot give freely, not for anything that costs you what you have rightly called the only security you've ever had, only for the chance to show you something different. I do not know how to proceed from here. I only know I am not willing to proceed as if the last 2 months have not happened. She read it 3 times. Then she folded it and put it in the pocket of her apron and went about her morning and did not take it out again until that night, alone, when she allowed herself the small, dangerous luxury of reading it once more by candlelight. She had not cried since her mother died. She did not cry now, but she sat for a long time with the letter in her hands and felt something shift inside her that had been fixed in place for a very long time. Some stubborn resistance she had built so carefully, so necessarily, and that now showed its first hairline crack. February brought the Dowager Duchess to a decision. She had observed her son for the better part of 2 months with growing unease, and she was not a woman who permitted unease to remain unaddressed. She sent for Martha Finch on the morning of the 4th of February, 1822, and received her in the small sitting room she reserved for conversations that required privacy and the implicit weight of her authority. Martha stood before her and was composed, which the Dowager found, to her credit, admirable. Most people were not composed in that room. The room was designed to prevent it. You are an intelligent girl, the Dowager said, which was true and was also the kindest thing she intended to say. You understand your situation clearly, so I will speak plainly. A pause. My son is susceptible, at present, to a kind of feeling that will pass. These things always pass. His injury has made him sentimental in ways he would not ordinarily permit himself. This is a medical condition, not a character revelation. Martha said nothing. Her hands were folded in front of her. If you are as intelligent as you appear, the Dowager continued, you will understand that the kindest thing you can do for him, for yourself, and for the household is to leave Kingsley Hall. I am prepared to provide you with an excellent character reference and a sum of money that will allow you to establish yourself in a position of considerably more comfort than you presently enjoy. Another pause. This is not a threat. It is an offer made in good faith. Martha looked at the Dowager Duchess of Kingsley, at this woman who had moved through the world her entire life on the assumption that her arrangements were the correct ones. and she felt something clarify inside her that had been muddied for weeks. "Your Grace," she said, "I appreciate your frankness. May I ask, does His Grace know you're having this conversation?" The briefest hesitation. "But the Duke's state of mind is precisely what we are discussing." "Then no," Martha said, very quietly. "He doesn't," she curtsied. "I'll give you my answer by the end of the week, Your Grace." She walked back through the corridor and down the servants' stairs and did not allow her face to do anything until she was completely alone. And then she stood in the small room between the kitchen and the linen press and pressed her back against the wall and breathed. She was being given the choice. She could leave cleanly, with money and references, with her dignity intact and the dangerous thing still safely locked away. Or she could stay and see what happened, knowing full well what usually happened to girls like her when they stayed for reasons that had nothing to do with practicality. She thought about her mother, about clocks that nobody winds. She thought about the letter in her apron pocket, worn soft at the folds from being opened and refolded too many times. She didn't leave. This was not a romantic decision. Or rather, it was not only a romantic decision, and Martha was too honest with herself to pretend otherwise. It was also a decision about what she was willing to let the world take from her without a fight. The dowager's offer was generous, and the dowager's logic was sound, and every practical consideration pointed toward the door. But she had spent her entire life making practical decisions, and at 22 years old, she found herself standing at the edge of something she had never once allowed herself to stand near, and she thought, if not this, then what? If not now, when I am still young enough that the wanting hasn't gone quiet yet? When? She sought out Percival herself. This was perhaps the most frightening thing she had ever done. And she had done frightening things. She found him in the stables in the late afternoon, where he had taken to spending time during his recovery, not riding yet, simply being near the horses in the way that some people are near animals when they need to be somewhere the performance of themselves is not required. He saw her come in and went very still, the way he did when he wasn't certain what to expect from her. "Your mother made me an offer," she said, standing in the stable doorway with the February light behind her. "Money, references, a clean departure." "I'll speak to her." "Don't." She came further in. The horses shifted. She was not wrong. She is not wrong. Everything she said about the situation is accurate. A pause. "I'm not leaving." He looked at her for a long moment. Something in his chest had been very tight for a very long time, and it loosened now in a way that was almost physical, almost painful. "You know what I'm asking," he said, "and you know what it will cost." "I know." She met his eyes, and she did not look away, which was itself an act of courage. "I have been afraid for as long as I can remember. I'm still afraid, but I've decided I'd rather be afraid and present than safe and absent." A beat. "I'm telling you this so you know. I'm not asking you for anything. I'm only telling you." He crossed the stable in 4 steps and took her face in both hands and kissed her once, very softly, as if she were something he was still not certain he was permitted to touch. She let him, and then she put her hand flat against his chest and stepped back, because she was not someone who lost herself entirely, not even then, not even with the warmth of his hand still on her cheeks and her heart doing something entirely undignified. "One step at a time," she said, which was also a warning, also a rule, also a small piece of armor she was keeping on for now. "One step at a time," he agreed. The spring of 1822 was the most complicated season Percival Kingsley had ever lived through, and he had previously considered himself a man who navigated complexity easily. He had not factored in what it cost to navigate complexity while also trying to become for the first time, a person worth the effort of knowing. He broke things off with Lady Edwina in March. He had asked for a private meeting, not in the drawing room, which felt theatrical, but in the small sitting room off the library, which had always been used for conversations that required honesty. She arrived knowing, he thought. Women like Edwina always knew before the words came. She sat very straight and looked at him with those clear, composed eyes and waited. He told her the truth, which was the only thing he could do, and also the most difficult. Not the full truth, he was not cruel, but the essential truth, that something had changed in him, that he was not the man she had agreed to wait for, and that she deserved someone who chose her entirely and without reservation. She was quiet for a long time after he finished. Long enough that he began to understand what genuine composure cost, and to feel ashamed that he had never had occasion to learn that cost himself. "I knew," she said finally. "I knew in December, when I sat beside you in that room and realized you were listening for something. And it was not me." A pause. "I want you to know that I do not blame her. I have thought about it carefully and I do not. She spoke to you honestly when no one else would. And the world is not often kind to women who do that. I hope you understand what you're asking of her." She stood, and the movement was entirely controlled. Not a tremor anywhere. "I hope you are worth it, Percival. I genuinely do." She left. He sat alone in the small sitting room for a considerable time afterward, and felt terrible, and knew that feeling terrible was correct and necessary, and the least he owed her. His mother did not speak to him for 2 weeks. Alistair, characteristically, found the whole thing wonderfully entertaining and brought brandy. Society noticed. Society, which had been waiting for an announcement, was now watching instead, with the sharpened interest of an audience that suspects something more interesting than the scheduled performance is about to occur. The Dowager managed the situation with the skill of decades. Everything was implications and carefully chosen silences, nothing confirmed, nothing denied. But she could not manage it indefinitely. Percival was aware of all of this. He was aware of the precise nature of the difficulty and the precise degree to which he was, for the first time, choosing something that cost him something, and he found with a kind of wondering surprise that the cost didn't frighten him. It clarified him, as if all the years of wanting nothing in particular had been a fog he'd been walking through without knowing it was a fog, and he had finally, because of one dark-haired, sharp-tongued, entirely impossible woman, found his way to solid ground. Martha, for her part, was learning how to trust in increments. She had been guarded for so long that opening was not a single act, but a series of small ones, each conversation a little longer, each silence a little more comfortable, each moment of letting herself be seen without immediately covering it over with practicality. It was the hardest thing she had ever done, harder than any of the physical labor she'd given her life to. It turned out that hope, when you'd been careful about it for years, was its own kind of exhaustion, but he was patient. She had not expected patience from him. She'd expected the push, the charm turned up, the relentless forward momentum of a man accustomed to getting what he wanted. Instead, he was steady. He showed up. He asked questions and listened to the answers and did not fill her silences with himself. He was, in ways she was slowly cataloguing with the care of someone who keeps exact records because they know how easily things get taken away. Exactly the person she had thought he might be underneath the performance. It was Alistair, unintentionally, who nearly destroyed everything. At a dinner party in April, a small gathering of close acquaintances, the kind that feels informal and is not, he said something, not cruelly, not even thoughtlessly, just with the slightly imprecise warmth of a man who has had enough port to drop the last of his social filters. Something that implied, to the sharp ears of two women seated nearby who were allies of the dowager and enemies of boredom, that the Duke's unusual behaviour since his accident might be explained by the influence of a particular member of the household staff. By morning, it was a murmur. By the following Tuesday, it was a whisper. By the end of the month, it had acquired the specific shape and velocity of a scandal. Martha heard it from one of the other maids, who told her with the slightly guilty relish of someone delivering bad news they find interesting, and she went very quiet in a way that the maid correctly identified as more frightening than any visible reaction would have been. She went to find Percival. He was already looking for her. They met in the upper gallery, both of them moving fast, and the expression on his face when he saw her was the expression of a man who has just understood the nature of what he has asked someone else to absorb on his behalf. "I know," he said, before she could speak. "I know. I'm sorry. This is exactly what I told you would happen." Her voice was controlled, but barely. "This is exactly I told you what I would lose. I told you what you wouldn't." "Martha, I need to leave." She said it flatly, practically. "I need to leave before this gets worse, before people start. I'm going to fix this." "You can't fix this." It came out harder than she'd intended. All the fear and frustration of months of being careful and impossible and right about everything sharpening into something that cut. "You cannot simply decide to fix something like this the way you decide to have a horse reshod. This is my reputation. This is the only thing I own that no one can take from me, and now people are taking it, and there is nothing." She stopped. She was shaking, very slightly, and she was furious with herself for shaking, and both of those things together made the shaking worse. "Martha." He said her name with such steadiness that it stopped her. "I am not going to let them take it from you. I am going to fix this, but not in the way you mean, not by managing it quietly or arranging for it to go away. I mean to address it directly." A pause. "I mean to offer you something that makes the story different." She looked at him. "Don't." "I'm not asking out of strategy. I'm asking because I should have asked before any of this happened, and I was afraid you'd say no, which was cowardly. I'm done being cowardly." He held her gaze with a steadiness she had never once seen him drop. "Marry me." The gallery was very quiet. "You're asking me because I'm in trouble," she said. "I'm asking you because you are the person I most want to have the argument we're currently having, and I realize that sounds strange, but I mean it entirely." A breath. "I'm asking because 5 months ago I woke up in the dark, and the first thing in the world I wanted was the sound of your voice. I'm asking because you know what I'm made of, the worst of it and the best of it, and you're still standing in this gallery arguing with me, which is the bravest and most extraordinary thing I have ever witnessed." He paused. "Say no if you mean no, but don't say no because you're afraid." She stood very still for a long time. The light came through the gallery windows in long afternoon bars, catching dust in the air, and outside a pigeon was making its feelings known about something on the south ledge, which was, she thought irrelevantly, a deeply unromantic backdrop for a moment like this. "Your mother will be dreadful about this," she said finally. The smallest alteration in his expression. "She will adjust. Society has survived more interesting scandals than this, and will survive this one too." He had not moved closer. He was still giving her space, which she registered as carefully as she registered everything he did. "I'm not asking you to fight my battles. I'm asking you to let me fight alongside you in yours." Martha looked at the man standing in front of her, at the version of Percival Kingsley that no one in his world had ever taken the trouble to find, because nobody had ever thought to speak to him honestly in the dark, and felt the last of the hairline crack open into something wide and irreversible. "Yes," she said. "Just that. Nothing more." He let out a breath that had clearly been waiting for some time. "One more thing," she said, because she was still herself. She was always going to be herself. "If you ever treat me as less than I am, less than what you know me to be, I will remind you of every single thing I said to you while you were unconscious, and I will not be gentle about it." "I would expect nothing less," he said, and this time his smile was not the easy, practiced charm she'd heard described. This one reached all the way in. They married in June. It was not, by any measure, an uneventful wedding. The Dowager Duchess was present and correct, and gave no visible indication that she had not fully supported the match from the beginning, which was itself a kind of extraordinary performance that Martha privately admired. Alistair cried, which he denied at the time and continued to deny for years afterward. The moment Martha had not expected came 2 days before the wedding, when the Dowager requested to see her alone. Martha had gone in with her jaw set and her hands folded, prepared for a final attempt at persuasion, or at the very least a catalogue of expectations. Instead, the Dowager had looked at her for a long moment across the writing desk and said, very quietly, "My son has not looked at anything the way he looks at you since he was 7 years old and had a horse he loved. He looked at that horse as though it were the best thing in the world and he could not believe his luck." A pause. "I am telling you this so you understand what you're the custodian of, not his title or his estate. That." She had not said anything further, and Martha had not been certain whether it was a blessing or a warning, and had concluded, walking back down the corridor, that it was probably both, which was the most honest thing anyone in that family had said to her. There was also a letter, sent to her father in Dorchester, not from Martha, but from Percival, written without telling her first and shown to her afterward with a slight wariness that she found unexpectedly moving. It was a brief letter. It said only that his daughter was well, that she was becoming a duchess, and that she had made her own way in the world by the force of her own character, and that he should know it. Martha had read it twice, standing in the library with the paper in her hands, and had felt something close over in her chest that had been open and draughty for 8 years, not healed exactly, but attended to, acknowledged. She had looked at Percival across the room and said nothing, because there was nothing adequate to say, and he had seemed to understand that, which was one of the 10,000 ways she was still learning him. Society took approximately 3 months to decide it approved. The determining factor, as best as anyone could reconstruct afterward, was that the new Duchess of Kingsley was clearly not impressed by her own situation, which society found both baffling and intriguing and eventually irresistible. She had opinions and expressed them. She had a way of looking at people that suggested she was cataloguing them accurately and without malice. She had, as one rather sharp observer noted in a letter to her sister, the confidence of a woman who knows exactly who she is and has simply been waiting for the world to catch up. On the 3rd of November, 1822, exactly 1 year to the day after the accident on Wyndham Road, Percival found her standing at the window of his study in the early morning, looking out at the grounds. The oak trees along the south lawn were doing the same melancholy thing they'd been doing the night she'd first sat beside his bed and begun to talk, though of course she didn't know he remembered that, and he hadn't told her yet, and he was still deciding how. She heard him come in and turned around, and her face in the morning light did the thing it sometimes did now. the thing he'd been waiting to see every morning for 5 months, and that still, without fail, stopped him, which was to do nothing, to simply be present, unguarded, not requiring anything of itself. It was the most beautiful thing he had ever seen any face do. "Thinking about something?" he asked. "I was thinking," she said, "that a year ago I was talking to an unconscious man about my dead mother and my deepest fears, and now I'm standing in his house, which is apparently also my house, looking at his grounds, which are apparently also my grounds, and I'm not certain I've entirely caught up to it." He crossed the room and came to stand behind her, his arms around her, looking out at the same grounds. And she let herself lean back against him in the way she'd only recently begun to let herself do. That allowing of weight, of being held, that turned out to be something you had to practice before it felt natural. But that felt, once it did, like something she had always been supposed to have. "You will catch up," he said, against her hair. "You're the most capable person I've ever known." She was quiet for a moment. Then, "The clock is winding." He understood. He held her tighter. "The clock is winding," he agreed. Outside, the November light settled over the frozen fountain and the bare elms and the grounds of Kingsley Hall, with the calm authority of a morning that knows exactly what it is and requires nothing more. The kind of light that is simply, entirely present. The kind that lasts. That's the end. And if you felt even a fraction of what Martha and Percival felt, then we did our job. Leave a comment telling us your favorite moment. Subscribe so you never miss the next story. And share this with someone who needs to believe.